Hello. At the end of the last video, you may recall me talking about those times in the school year when it seems that enthusiasm for learning and for what we're doing in the classroom is at its lowest ebb. That students almost seem to sit back in their chairs and say, "Come on, teach me, I dare you." Well, that lethargy, that loss of focus and intensity can occur for some very understandable reasons. The students may simply be worn out, such as maybe they're in the midst of a period of tournament basketball and everyone's going to the games at night and everyone's getting home late. It could be like here in Michigan that we're in the midst of the month of February, where winter seems to be interminable and everyone has cabin fever and we're just sick of it, and it's hard to generate much enthusiasm. But this lethargy, this loss of enthusiasm for what's going on in class can occur for some very important reasons, and reasons which are very much within our control. When that occurs in my classroom, when I see students enter my classroom with a look on their face that suggests that they're expecting the routine, and that routine is going to be useless. Do you remember that term, useless? Oh, in the last video, I talked about students of mine teaching English overseas right now, and that on 3 occasions they talk about the useless education that the students in English had received prior to their inheriting them, and how these students had head knowledge but were totally incapable of actually expressing themselves. Well, students here in America can get that sense too. They get that sense that the education they're receiving is useless, and that it's not going to lead to the ability to actually relate in this new language that they're purportedly learning. Well, when that occurs, and the students' enthusiasm inevitably drops, and their attitude toward the class becomes almost sullen, I look to see if one of 4 elements is missing from my program. I call them the 4 pillars of world language education. If one of these 4 is missing, things are going to be shaky in class. If 2 are missing, my program is going to just crumble. And so what are these 4 elements? First of all, I look at the very simple matter of curriculum. Does the curriculum that we are using respect the natural language acquisition sequence? Now, I defined this sequence in video number 2. And in that video, I talked about a natural order to the learning of one's native language proceeds from from years spent, but in the classroom, it'll be months of speaking and listening. Actually, listening first and then speaking. Listening and speaking. In my classroom, this will go on for several months before the students are ever introduced to the written word at all. And then once they have attained what I defined in video number 3 as relative oral fluency, they're ready to be exposed to phonics instruction and then to elementary reading as well, without neglecting the skills of listening and speaking. I never want to drop those. And then finally, typically after almost a year of primarily oral interaction, I'm ready to expose my students to the skill of writing. So you see that order right there, from listening and speaking to reading, significantly later to reading, to much later to writing. If it is not respected in our curriculum, our students will start to develop that 5-step thought process that leads to unwieldy, awkward, slow speech, such as I just explained in video number 1. And students, they're not ignorant. They understand. They can tell what's happening to them. They can tell that they're incapable of actually expressing themselves in speech to a classmate or to you as well. And at that, they get the sense at that point that their education is useless. So first, I look to see, is the curriculum that I'm using, is it respecting their natural language learning sequence? Students can accept a language class in which reading and writing is proving to be a challenge for them to learn. But they will not forgive a teacher, and they'll not accept a language course in which they are aware that they're becoming totally incapable of ever actually speaking this language, and that there's no likelihood that any change is forthcoming. Not long ago, I received this email from a former student of mine telling about a summer mission project in which she participated. Now, having exclusively studied under the ULET program while she was in high school, this meant that she'd spent, actually in her class, it was an entire year and a half before ever being exposed to the written word. And once I'd laid the solid oral foundation in her mind and in the mind of her classmates, I was able to proceed to reading and writing with great ease. Because, and here's the key, she already knew how the language was supposed to sound before she ever dealt with it in printed form. And therefore teaching reading and writing was exceedingly easy. Well, let me read this email to you and see what you can glean regarding the sense of satisfaction that she experienced because her instruction had respected the natural language acquisition sequence. She wrote, "I wanted to tell you about how much my Spanish training has already come in handy this summer. I went on a mission trip a few weeks ago, and one of the girls on my mission team is from Costa Rica. I found that it was very natural for me to be able to converse with her, and we could understand each other very well. She later told me that I am the first high school student that she has been able to have a real conversation with, which was very special to me. For that, I have to say thank you." Well, when the student said that the ability to actually speak with this Costa Rican girl was very special to her, in essence, what she's saying is the education I received has been useful. This education, which has respected the natural language acquisition sequence, has resulted in my ability to actually communicate with somebody whom I would not have potentially known otherwise. Now, does delaying exposure to the written word until a sound oral foundation of relative oral fluency has been laid, does delaying exposure to the written word mean that in the long run these students trained under this method are going to be somewhat deficient in the skills of reading and writing? Nothing could be farther from the truth. Let's take a look at this email written by a student in her first year of college Spanish, as she reflects back on the consequences, the results of the training she received under the ULAT program. "Since I learned to speak first, you'd think I wouldn't do as well in writing. But I think learning to speak first only made my writing more logical and flow better." Speaking about her college classmates, she added, "Sometimes we would peer edit each other's papers in class, and people would use sentences in their papers that made no sense. They were using some of the right words, but in the incorrect order, and it was actually pretty confusing and frustrating." Well, her writing was more logical and flowed better because of the way in which she'd been trained to think as she speaks this new language, and a two-step thought process, and because of the oral emphasis and the respecting of the natural language acquisition sequence that occurred in her high school training. She already knew, and this is the key, she already knew what the language should sound like before she ever learned how to put it in, or transcribe it into written form. The best chance of success both in reading and writing expression depends upon having laid a strong oral foundation in our students, so that they know how the language should sound, which gives them the ability to predict. That's the ability to anticipate a word's meaning and anticipate its proper pronunciation when encountering that word in written form for the first time. Well, that's the first of the 4 pillars. That is to say, does my curriculum respect the natural language acquisition sequence? Secondly, the second pillar that needs to be in place if student enthusiasm and interest is to remain high is the issue of relationship. Am I providing my students with the opportunity to relate to native speakers of this language that we're learning in such a way that my students sense that the application of their learning goes beyond the American classroom, the walls of the American classroom? In other words, is learning this new language that I'm trying to convey to them, is it just some kind of an arcane academic game which is being carried out among native speakers of English who could very easily relate to each other in English, as opposed to employing this or handicapping ourselves with this new language? Because that's the elephant in the room. It's the fact that the students know very well that the teacher, as well as all of their classmates, are quite capable of interacting with them in English. And so we need to find a way to expose them. Just like I had, prior to my senior year of high school, the chance to go and live with a French family in northern France during the course of the summer. We need to give our students the opportunity to enter into relationships with native speakers of the language they're learning so that their intensity will heighten because they recognize the importance of this tool, this skill that they're acquiring, because now they know people actually use it. Well, in my classroom, I tried to use, I loved it if students, of course, would go and spend, like I did, their summer in a French or Spanish-speaking country. However, I couldn't depend upon that taking place for all of my students. So during the year, I used online international classroom exchange programs, which allowed me to pair up students with a classroom overseas, where they would be matched up one-on-one with a student in another classroom, and where my classroom would interact as a group with students from another classroom in the country where the target language was the native language. My students would send emails back and forth, and before they could actually read and write, they would record their voice talking about their lives. They'd record the voice in the form of a sound file. They'd attach that sound file to an email, and they'd send it to their correspondent overseas. They made PowerPoint presentations, which were just replete with photos, pictures of themselves, and in which they spoke in simple English. They typed in simple English about themselves and received the same kind of PowerPoint presentations in return from their partners. They couldn't necessarily read all that was written, but the very fact of seeing these images reminded them that this is a real person overseas for whom this language I'm learning is their native language. We conducted video conferencing activities with the classroom overseas as well, finding creative ways to work around the whole issue of the time change when that was a problem. So the first pillar, of course, is curriculum. It's got to be a curriculum which is consistent with how people actually learn their native language as they're learning a second. Secondly, relationship. My students have to enter into relationship with people who speak this target language, this language that we're learning. And then thirdly, I need to employ in the classroom to keep interest high, to keep enthusiasm from waning. The gift, really, it's a gift given to us, you might say, of storytelling. Everyone loves a good story. People the world over and of all ages love to hear a good story. And so the strategic use of videos in the target language to stimulate conversation is an important third pillar of any world language program. I say videos. It can be, later on, it can be, of course, written literature as well. With my students, I do a number of activities as I show them a video. I show them an excerpt of the video, and then we'll go back and I'll stop the video at a key frame regarding some important element of the story, and I'll have them, for oral participation points, by the way, I'll have them describe for me what's taking place in the scene that they see on the screen in the front of the classroom, or I'll ask them questions about what's happening, or very likely there are times when I will have them try to tell the story on the basis of these images, and it can be very humorous how far off track they can get, trying to understand what's actually taking place in the story. But the key is not that they be accurate initially at relaying the plot. The key is that my students are, as they try to convey what's happening in the video, they're practicing these linguistic skills that I want them to be practicing, with which I want them to become at ease. When I'm with the more advanced students, of course, we can use literature. Here you see at the ulat.com website that if I click on lessons and then choose a language, we'll take Spanish in this instance, and then go to the bottom of the table of contents, it says video and book studies. We'll go to the video and book studies which are appropriate for public schools this time. And let me enter in my password here. If I click on, let's take El Principito, Le Petit Prince, The Little Prince, and chapter 15, you see that students are, as we talk about the story, they're presented with a simplified summary of the contents of the particular chapter that we've just read in its original version. And the new vocabulary is defined for them, actually in Spanish. No English is used whatsoever. And then the second section, they have to try to come up with the vocabulary from the first section, which completes this same summary, the same description. And then the third section, they're given questions to which we discuss these questions together, although they could they could write the answers as well. And these questions are questions on the level of observation and interpretation as what's happening within the particular episode or chapter. But most importantly, this next section I think is the most important. Aplicar a la vida, application questions. Questions that allow the student to bring that information down to the level of their own personal lives. What it has to do with them personally and how they would respond in such and such a situation. So this is one way in which we use storytelling to develop students' linguistic abilities in the ULAT.